The cold metal of the park bench seeped straight through my coat, and the snow kept falling like the night had decided to erase me one quiet inch at a time. My breath came out uneven, fogging the air, while the city glowed softly in the distance, still celebrating Christmas Eve as if nothing had ended. Just hours earlier, my marriage had collapsed without shouting, without tears, leaving me sitting there with nowhere left to go. If you're watching this and you've ever had your life fall apart in silence, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because moments like this happen more often than we admit. I remember staring at my bare hands, numb and shaking, trying to understand how everything I trusted could vanish so calmly. The world kept moving, lights blinking, cars passing, while I stayed frozen in that moment, unaware that this night was about to change me forever. That was the moment everything truly began to unravel. I was sitting alone on a frozen park bench on Christmas Eve, my breath fogging the air, my hands tucked uselessly into my coat pockets. The city around me was quiet in that strange holiday way, lights glowing behind windows that no longer felt meant for me. 3 hours earlier, my marriage ended, not with shouting or drama, but with a sentence that emptied my chest and left everything else echoing. Snow drifted down in slow, careless flakes, softening the sidewalks and muting the world. I could feel the cold seeping through my jeans, through my skin, all the way into my bones, yet it barely registered. What stunned me wasn't the temperature, it was the silence inside my own head. I kept waiting for tears, for panic, for something loud enough to match the damage. Nothing came. I sat there, staring at the dark outline of bare trees, realizing how quickly a life can split into before and after. That bench, that night, became the dividing line, and beneath the numbness a quiet thought began to form inside me. I was 55 years old, and for most of my adult life I thought consistency was the same thing as love. I had been married for nearly 3 decades, long enough that our routines felt permanent. I woke early, made coffee the way he liked it, folded laundry while the house was still quiet. I remembered birthdays, refilled prescriptions, smoothed over rough days without ever being asked. The holidays were my territory. I wrapped gifts with care, cooked the meals everyone expected, kept traditions alive because someone had to. I took pride in being reliable, in being the person who never dropped the ball. It felt good to be needed, even when no one said thank you. Over time, I started to notice how little space I took up. Conversations moved around me. Decisions were made without my input. I told myself that was just how long marriages worked, that comfort mattered more than attention. I believed stability was proof that we were doing something right. Looking back, I can see how quietly things were thinning out. Nothing shattered, nothing exploded. My life didn't look broken from the outside, but that sense of safety I trusted so completely was already cracking, and I just didn't know it yet. I thought I had time, and I was wrong about everything. Earlier that evening, everything felt slightly off in a way I couldn't name. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted ham, the familiar markers of Christmas Eve, but the air between us felt thin. He moved through the rooms with a careful distance, like someone already halfway gone, and my body sensed the truth before my mind could catch up. When the moment came, it didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived calmly, deliberately, as if he had practiced saying the words until they no longer hurt him. I remember standing still, listening, feeling my chest hollow out as I understood that this wasn't a discussion. It was a decision that had been made somewhere else. Long before that night, what cut deepest wasn't just that there was someone else, it was the comparison. In his explanation, I was recast as comfort instead of desire, familiarity instead of excitement. Words like safe and predictable surfaced in my memory, followed by the one that landed hardest, the reminder that I had aged while someone else had not. I realized then how quietly I had been replaced, not only in his life but in his imagination. I searched his face for hesitation, for remorse, for anything that suggested we were still standing on the same ground. There was nothing, only relief. That was the moment I understood that our marriage hadn't ended that evening. It had ended in the months he spent detaching, planning, and choosing a future that didn't include me. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in. Every shared photo, every tradition suddenly felt unbearable. Staying meant suffocating inside a life that no longer wanted me, and my body knew I had to leave before my heart fully broke. I grabbed my coat without thinking, driven by instinct alone, needing cold air more than answers, space more than explanations, and silence more than times. I don't remember deciding to leave. I only remember the door closing behind me and the cold hitting my face like a slap, sharp enough to keep me moving. I walked without direction, past houses glowing with Christmas lights, past families gathering around tables I no longer belonged to. My boots scraped against frozen pavement, each step automatic, disconnected from thought. At first, there was still a trace of anger in me, a low burn under my ribs, but it didn't last. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. The night swallowed sound, snow softened the streets, and my emotions followed. Blunted and slow, it felt like my body was carrying me while my mind floated somewhere above it. Watching without feeling, my fingers went numb. My breath came out in short white clouds. I didn't check the time. I didn't check my phone. There was nowhere to go and no one I wanted to talk to. I just needed space, air, distance from the walls that had witnessed my life falling apart. Without realizing how I got there, I found myself in the park. The paths were empty, the trees stripped bare, their branches etched against the sky. I stopped walking because my legs simply wouldn't carry me anymore. I sank onto a bench, cold seeping through my clothes, my thoughts finally going still. I sat there, alone, emptied out, unaware that the night wasn't finished changing me yet. I might have stayed there all night if the sound hadn't reached me first. It was faint, uneven. Not the steady rhythm of footsteps, but something slower, strained. At first I thought it was the wind shifting through the trees, but then it came again, closer, unmistakably human. I turned and saw him moving along the path behind the bench, an older man, bundled in mismatched layers, shoulders hunched, each step careful and labored. What stopped me cold wasn't his clothes, it was his feet, bare against the snow, red and swollen, leaving shallow prints that filled almost immediately. The sight cut through my numbness like a blade. For a moment, I stayed seated. My body was tired. My heart was raw. A selfish, quiet voice inside me whispered that I had nothing left to give, that tonight had already taken everything from me. I told myself someone else would help him, that maybe he knew what he was doing, that I wasn't responsible. But as he shuffled closer, wincing with each step, those excuses fell apart. Whatever pain I was carrying, it wasn't going to cost me my life before morning. His might. The comparison landed hard and clear. My heartbreak suddenly felt abstract next to the danger unfolding in front of me. I felt something stir that hadn't moved since earlier that evening. Not hope, not strength. Just a simple human pull toward another person in need. I thought about how invisible I had felt in my own home, how easily someone had looked past me. I couldn't do that now. I couldn't look away. My legs ached as I stood, cold biting through my clothes, but the decision itself felt steady. Whatever this night had taken from me, it hadn't taken my ability to care. I stepped off the path toward him, not knowing his name, not knowing his story, only knowing that walking past him would be something I could never forgive myself for. The closer I got, the more aware I became of my own feet, warm inside my boots, protected in a way his clearly weren't. The cold was sharp that night, biting enough that I knew what stepping out of them would mean. My toes already ached just imagining it, but the thought didn't stop me. It clarified things. I remember thinking how strange it was that emotional pain could dull fear so completely. My heart had been cracked open hours earlier. Compared to that, cold felt manageable, temporary. I told myself I could stand it for a while. I told myself that whatever discomfort waited for me was nothing compared to what would happen to him if he kept walking like this. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. I crouched down and tugged my boots off, the air rushing in immediately, stinging my socks, my skin. I held them out without ceremony, aware of how exposed I suddenly was, aware of how final the choice felt once my feet touched the snow. There was hesitation on his side, the kind that comes from pride and disbelief, but survival won. I watched as he eased his feet into the boots, relief softening the lines in his face. That alone was enough. I didn't need gratitude. I didn't need acknowledgement. I just needed to know he'd be warmer than he had been moments before he moved on. He pressed something small into my hand, a worn coin, smooth from years of use. It felt solid, unexpectedly warm. I closed my fingers around it as he shuffled away, and then I was alone again. I stood there barefoot in the snow, numb, spreading upward, clutching that tiny token. I felt exposed, ridiculous, and strangely steady all at once, unaware that this quiet moment would follow me long after the cold finally faded. The days after Christmas passed in a soft blur, as if time itself had decided to move gently around me. I stayed inside mostly, wrapped in a blanket, watching daylight fade without really noticing when it arrived. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, every sound too loud or too absent. I moved through simple routines without purpose. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I sat on the couch and stared at nothing. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and unrefreshing. Grief wasn't sharp anymore. It was flat, heavy, like a fog that refused to lift, again and again. My hand found the small coin in my pocket or on the table beside me. I turned it over, tracing its worn edges, trying to remember the warmth of that brief human connection. That moment on the bench felt more real than anything else in those days, as if it belonged to a different life entirely. I didn't think about meaning or consequences. I just held on to the weight of it, the proof that something kind had happened in the middle of everything falling apart. The rest of my life felt paused, unfinished, waiting. Something still waited. The silence of the house broke with a low, distant rumble that didn't belong there. At first I thought it was a snowplow passing too close, or maybe a truck struggling on the icy street. But the sound didn't fade. It multiplied, deep and steady, vibrating faintly through the walls. I stood up slowly, heart starting to thud in a way it hadn't in days. The living room felt suddenly too small, too exposed. I moved toward the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look out, and my breath caught. One black SUV sat at the curb, then another behind it, then another. Sleek, oversized, identical, lining the street with unsettling precision. By the time I counted them all, there were 14, parked nose to tail. Dark shapes against the pale winter afternoon. They looked official, purposeful, completely out of place in front of my modest house. My mind raced, grasping for explanations that made no sense. I had never been in trouble. I lived quietly. I barely left the house. Why would this be happening to me? A wave of fear rolled through my chest, sharp and cold, replacing the numbness I'd been living inside. Doors opened, men stepped out, dressed neatly, moving with calm coordination. No flashing lights, no shouting, just presence. Authority without explanation. I backed away from the window, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house, final and deliberate. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay where I was, but my feet carried me forward anyway. I reached the door, hands trembling, and opened it just enough to see who stood on the porch. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. The man standing there was familiar, impossible, clean-cut, composed, dressed in a tailored dark suit. Nothing like the figure I remembered from the snow. Recognition hit me all at once, knocking the air from my lungs, and I knew my life was about to shift again. It took a few seconds for my mind to catch up with my eyes. The man on my porch had the same calm gaze, the same quiet presence, but everything else about him was different. Gone were the worn layers and the exhaustion I remembered. In their place stood someone composed, confident, unmistakably in control. My heart raced as my memory tried to reconcile the two images as he stepped inside and began to explain. Disbelief washed over me in slow waves. The man I met in the park hadn't been homeless at all. He was the head of a large global company, someone whose name carried weight far beyond my small living room. After losing his wife months earlier, he had stepped away from his world of money and influence, choosing to move through cities anonymously, stripped of status, to understand how people treated someone who had nothing to offer, listening. I replayed that night on the bench with new eyes. The hesitation in his movements, the careful way he watched others pass, the quiet dignity beneath the hardship, it all clicked into place. He hadn't been testing me. He had been testing the world, searching for something real in a life that had become crowded with people who wanted something from him. What shook me most was the realization that my kindness hadn't been extraordinary. I hadn't known who he was. I hadn't expected anything in return. I had simply seen another person in danger and acted. Hearing him acknowledge that, hearing how rare that simple response had been for him, made something inside my chest loosen. The confusion that had filled my house moments earlier gave way to a steady, grounding calm. That night in the snow was no longer just a moment of pain and cold. It had become proof that even at my lowest, I hadn't lost myself. And as the weight of that truth settled in, I sensed that he hadn't come only to explain the past. He was here because that choice had opened a door neither of us had expected. After the truth settled between us, the room grew quiet in a different way, not tense, not fearful, just full. He spoke about his foundation, about the work it did and the work it was failing to do, and how disconnected it had become from the people it was meant to serve. As I listened, I felt strangely small and strangely seen at the same time. Then he explained why he was really there. He wanted me to join them, not as a favor, not as charity, but as someone he believed could make a difference, a leadership role, real responsibility, a salary that made my head spin. The words barely felt real as they landed. Me. After everything that had just happened, after being left, dismissed, replaced, my first reaction wasn't excitement, it was fear. I thought about my age, about how long it had been since I'd stepped into anything new. I thought about how safe my life had been, even when it was shrinking. A voice inside me whispered that this was too much, too late, meant for someone else. But another part of me stirred, quieter, braver. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to build something meaningful, to matter in a way I hadn't in years. Still, I didn't answer. The offer sat between us, heavy and unreal, while the wreckage of my old life hovered close behind me, waiting to see which way I would turn. I was still turning the offer over in my mind when the knock came. It wasn't loud or urgent, just familiar enough to tighten something in my chest. When I opened the door, I knew immediately why he was there. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The confidence he had walked out with was gone, replaced by uncertainty and a careful kind of regret. I listened as he tried to explain himself, though his reasons felt thin even as they landed. Things hadn't worked out. The excitement had faded. The life he imagined hadn't materialized. What he wanted now wasn't me, not really. It was the comfort I had always provided, the steadiness, the place where things were predictable and forgiving. As he stood there, I became acutely aware of how different I felt. A week earlier, his return might have shattered me. I might have searched his face for reassurance, for proof that I was still chosen. Now, I saw the pattern clearly. He wasn't coming back out of love. He was coming back because the alternative had failed. I felt no rush of anger, no need to argue or convince him of what he had lost. I simply understood that the version of myself who would have accepted this no longer existed. I had been offered something new, not just a job, but a future built on respect and purpose. When I closed the door, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and steady. The sound echoed through the house, final and clean, and for the first time, it felt like I was choosing myself without apology. I said yes, quietly, without ceremony. And the next morning, I stepped into a life that didn't know my old name. The building felt too large, the hallways too bright, and I was suddenly aware of my age in a way I hadn't been in years. Everyone seemed faster, sharper, more certain. I wondered if they could see the cracks I still carried. The first days were uncomfortable. I second-guessed every decision, replayed small mistakes, went home exhausted from trying to prove I belonged. I felt like an imposter wearing borrowed confidence, but the work itself slowed me down. It required listening, patience, and an attention to people that couldn't be rushed. I began to notice something unexpected. When others hesitated, unsure how to respond, I didn't freeze. I knew how to sit with discomfort. I understood fear, loss, and silence because I had lived inside them. My past, the marriage, the night in the snow, all of it had given me a steadiness I hadn't recognized before. Little by little, the space stopped feeling foreign. My shoulders relaxed, my voice steadied. I stopped apologizing for what I didn't know and started trusting what I did. Experience turned into instinct. Compassion turned into skill. One afternoon, walking out after a long day, I realized I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was participating, inhabiting, and that felt solid under my feet. 6 months later, I stood inside a building that used to be an empty lot, watching people fill a space that had once existed only as an idea. The doors were open, light spilling across freshly worn floors, and the noise wasn't overwhelming anymore. It was alive. I moved through the rooms slowly, recognizing small details I had argued for, adjusted, protected. A corner where someone could sit quietly, a table meant for shared meals, walls painted in colors chosen to feel calm rather than impressive. None of it was flashy, but all of it mattered. I watched a mother help her son hang his coat. I noticed an older man settle into a chair like he expected to be there. These moments landed differently now. They felt earned. I wasn't saving anyone. I was building something steady enough for people to rest inside. As I crossed the courtyard, I saw my ex-husband at the far end of the street. He was just another figure passing through, hands in his pockets, eyes elsewhere. There was no rush in my chest, no story attached. He belonged to a life I no longer lived. What surprised me most was the calm. I knew where I was needed. I trusted my judgment. The woman who once sat barefoot in the snow felt distant, but not erased. She had carried me here. I stayed until evening, locking up with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't a rescue or a miracle. It was continuity, purpose, and a life that finally fit, and it felt completely, undeniably mine. I used to think that night was the end of my life as I knew it. Sitting alone in the cold, barefoot and stunned, I believed everything meaningful had already happened behind me. What I see now is different. That moment was not an ending. It was a doorway I never would have chosen, but one that led me somewhere honest. Loss stripped me down to what was real. It took away the roles I hid inside and left me face to face with my own worth, not the kind that comes from being chosen or needed or familiar, but the kind that exists quietly, even when no one is watching. I learned that courage doesn't always feel brave. Sometimes it feels like standing still long enough to notice someone else hurting. If you are listening to this while your life feels broken open, I want you to know something. You are not late, you are not invisible, and you are not foolish for grieving what you thought your future would be. There is nothing weak about tenderness. There is nothing small about starting again. I didn't rebuild my life by erasing the pain. I carried it with me and let it teach me where I belonged. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in choices, quiet ones, human ones. Today, I can hold my past without flinching. I can stand where I am without fear and say with calm certainty that even devastating nights can lead us home. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. It means more than I can explain that you chose to listen and hold space for a piece of my life. If any part of this resonated with you, I hope it reminded you that none of us are alone in the moments that break us open. We all have nights, choices, and turning points that reshape who we become, if you feel comfortable. I would love for you to share your own moment like that in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, and if this story moved you, a simple like or share helps it reach others who might need it too.